Yeah, just on that live export space as well. That you mentioned about the plan will be to transition to a greater proportion of boxed and chilled and frozen product going, but there are supply chain issues just transferring across from that as well. From certainly from an in-country perspective, there's the cultural and religious aspect that they do prefer for some instances to have the live slaughter there, in that country. But then there's also the cold chain kind of logistics. So there are countries out there that take live animals, and part of the reason is because the wet market style is what suits their infrastructure in terms of cold chain logistics. Not all of the customers that are overseas taking those live export animals have the capacity to store meat in the freezer at home like we do. So there's that kind of Western element where we just assume that everyone's standard of living is as high as ours in terms of having access to the ability to cold store meat and freeze it at home or go to a supermarket and get it that way. There are preferences for those wet market types, and that's driven partially by that refrigeration aspect. But then from the supply chain within Australia, we've also got, and particularly in West Australia, you've got only a handful of processors. So, there's a capacity constraint kind of thing too that you can't just click your fingers and have a new abattoir. And even if you can, over time, invest money and build new abattoirs, new facilities, you need to have the skilled staff that are there to be able to operate and to get the volumes through. Currently, if you look at abattoirs across Australia, they're running at about 50 or 60% capacity. Now, part of that's because we've got a small flock and a small herd at the moment. We're rebuilding at this stage, but that's part of the constraint. But the other aspect that if they did have the big numbers coming through, they don't have the staff to be able to process. So it's not, you don't just click your fingers here and make those supply chain issues happen. And I think if COVID's shown us anything, having a more diverse supply chain and having access to multiple options is the preferred option really when it comes to these issues. We saw some problems. A lot of those boxed and chilled meat products actually piggybacks the flights, the international flights going in and out, the passenger flights. So for a period there when COVID hit and everything shut down with those passenger flights, there had to be alternative arrangements made to contract out flights to get meat products sent overseas as a boxed item because there was no passenger flights going, and that's where again the live export space was still running ships. So, that kind of diversity of supply chain, I think, is an important thing that we need to consider. Diversity in any of those markets is something that makes a market much more robust to any of these types of shocks that can come along.
Yeah, as you talk about that, Matt, it makes me think about something while we're still on four legs on the wool side. I think the now former coalition government might have even put out to tender or certainly was trying to stimulate a processing option on the wool front, either domestically or in our region in alternative to China. I know the Albanese incoming government have said, we want to be a country that makes things. Does that going to extend to food and fibre, or are we kidding ourselves? Is it more realistic maybe in Southeastern Asia we're going to see some extra processing capability come on so we're not so reliant, say, on China?
Look, I think around the world there will be a bit more focus on, shorter supply chains. I think that's part of the reason why we're going to see inflation is because we're not going to be reliant on exporting our production around the world in a lot of cases. But it's very hard to do that. We can't produce everything we want. If you look at something like an iPhone is a good example, yeah? We all want an iPhone, but it is produced with thousands of different parts that are produced in different parts of the world and then assembled somewhere. And so realistically, we cannot produce everything we want in Australia, and we never will be able to. And let's be honest, not that many people actually want to work in a factory. Let's be completely honest. So how are we going to get staff to fill factories? And so I think we'll see more automation to get to that. But in reality, I think, there's only so far a country with a population of 25 to 27 million can actually do. And, we don't even have a big enough domestic market in a lot of cases to even make it worthwhile. We're a tiny country. And so I don't see it as being able to massively increase our domestic consumption, production. But it might be a case of more strategic relationships with allied type of countries. Again, that comes back to that sort of trade blocks, but also sort of protectionism in a group form.
Now, on that automation front, I think John Deere threw us a PR statement not long ago talking about how they were going to put out a battery-operated, automated tractor or something like that, major forms of machinery within the next 3 or 4 years. With the farm labour shortage, I'll put this to Murray Watt, the Agriculture Minister. I said, when you've got this debate about the ag visa, Michael McCormack, the Shadow Minister for Pacific, told me recently, look, we can't just rely on the Pacific, we need labour from elsewhere. And I said to Murray Watt, look, if you make it hard for us to get that labour on farm, they're just going to move towards automation, going to cut their losses and go, look, let's scale up and get bigger machines that do the work for us.
It's already happened. Let's be honest. We've seen more, maybe not full automation, but we've seen bigger and bigger machinery over the last couple of decades. We've seen larger farms. Look, and that the reality is we sort of grumble about reduced populations, inability to keep the school running, the football team, whatever it may be. Yeah, the reality is that's because we've got far less people living in the country. The reason we've got less people living in the country is because we don't need as many people. We don't need, if we've got 1,000 hectares, we don't need dozens of people to be working that land. We only need one, or probably not even one labour unit to farm 1,000 hectares if it's cropping. So that's all this further and further automation will just see, the countryside becoming more and more quiet, I guess. And I think the only parts of the countryside that we'll see sort of an upswing will probably be those sort of peri-urban fringe, places within an hour to 2 hours of the city. They'll become very popular, and they'll be full of people who are, working in the country, but commute to the city every now and then. So I think we'll all see a change, and I think that's just a natural occurrence. And that, if we're honest, that's been happening for 200 years around the world.
Yeah, and part of that,
it just might speed up.
And part of the challenge that comes with that automation, you say it might speed up, is how long it takes for the machine to arrive. We're talking to a farmer recently, they ordered a seeder for this season, hasn't arrived yet, and they're not sure it'll even arrive for next season. I guess for farmers that are making decisions, even listening to this podcast, with the Labor government in for at least the next 3 years, they might be thinking, well, maybe it's time we bite the bullet and put the order in, because it could take that, several years for us to get the machines we need.
Everything's taking longer. There's nothing that isn't coming on time anymore. And I think that's why when we're looking at what we do, we're looking at the decisions that we do, is we probably can't delay in a lot of cases. The issue we've got is that if you're buying that Land Cruiser, which is, I think a Land Cruiser is 2 year wait now for 79. I think it just means we've got to plan longer and longer in advance. We can't expect to be able to go and pick up a new piece of equipment or order it and get it 2 months later. It's order and get it a year later if you're lucky. That's just the way that the whole logistical and supply chain environment's going to be for quite some time, I imagine.
And is that something we, expected? It just seems counterintuitive to me. We had this just-in-time ordering and logistics going on even, 4 or 5, 6 years ago. But it's just, I know it's because of, the GFC and shutdown of factories. China's a big player in that. Do you see this is going to be the new normal, or is it possible if the world roars into action again, we might see those sorts of timelines, come back to what we were used to with just-in-time ordering?
Look, we used just-in-time ordering because it was the best. It allowed things to be cheap, it allowed things to be quick, and that's why we did it. And the reality is, at some point, that will still probably be the best option. At some point, if we get beyond this uncertainty. And really, just-in-time supply chains broke down in basically February 2020. When COVID hit and China closed down, supply chains were munted, and that's what happened. Is we ended up with the just-in-time breaking down, and it's probably still, when it works, and it worked for 40 years. 50 years. But the reality is that it's not working now. And that's what the pandemic has done. But we could see that go back to normal once things repair themselves. Because it takes time, because when you think about it, you've had 3 months in China where they've been locked down and containers really haven't been moving at anywhere near the same pace. So then there's sort of as China reopens, there's a bit of a burp or a cough as all these container ships leave China. And then you get blockages at all the ports at destination. So these things take a long time to sort of unravel, because that is the extent of the disruption that we've had for the last 2 years. And I think this sort of disruption, we're going to have issues for probably the next year, 2 years.
Do you not think, though, that part of the experience we saw with that supply chain disruption through COVID has made some consider being reliant just on having a primary reliance on one particular country or one particular trading partner, one particular supplier? Is it made people consider
human nature, mate? Human nature, isn't it? Like let's say, for instance, the world gets back to their normality, yeah, and Jimmy, who buys bearings, yeah, he gets bearings made in some factory in Adelaide, yeah, and he pays $12 a bearing, yeah. But my supply chain sorted. I know I've got those bearings. They're going to cost me $12, and but I know if anything goes wrong, I'm still going to get them for $12. However, Angus down the road, supply chains are back to normal, and he starts getting those bearings from China for $2. Well, who's got the competitive advantage? Angus with his $2 bearings. And that's what will happen, is we'll get back to the reality of it'll be the cheapest who wins the business. And whilst we might talk at the moment, we're all concerned about supply chains, all this kind of stuff. But once supply chains fix themselves, it'll be back to a case of, well, what's the cheapest we can get our product built at? And in many cases, it's not going to be built in Australia. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, from that perspective, though, then it sounds like it'll be a bit of a pipe dream to reinvigorate any other form of manufacturing in Australia, because we are a high wage country compared to our nearest neighbours into the southeast of Asia. So that's part of the reason why we saw the decline of the car industry and other manufacturing industries. I mean, from that perspective, I think the meat processing industry is probably the only or the largest manufacturing style employer would be that sector. Now,
I was talking to somebody this morning, yeah, and they got their son a job on a construction site in Melbourne, labourer, moving bricks, $150,000 a year. And I'm looking at my wage and thinking, geez, maybe it's time for me to start hefting bricks around. But the reality is that, it's hard work. Labouring is hard work, but it's cleaner than working in an abattoir. So how are we going to get abattoir workers when they can go work labouring for $150? That's a professional level wage, no skill.
So a labourer in a brick construction place is earning half the wage of a radio presenter, Ricky.
Depends which presenter you're talking to. Not this one. Certainly not this one. Look, Andrew, you would probably talk about that's just classic supply and demand at the end of the day as well. But I know, in politics where I was previously involved, we were talking about this, tradespeople and, the looming shortage, because we had a whole lot of young people that were looking at potentially, doing a profession of some sort at university. But were we going to have enough tradies, the bricklayers and that sort of thing? And now those chickens seem to have come home to roost.
Yeah, well, this particular guy, he was telling me his son is a qualified teacher. Why are you going to work in a school for $80,000 or $90,000? And he'll lug bricks around for $150.
And generally, the bricks generally behave better too.
Yeah, but you finish work at 4 or 5 o'clock, and that's you done.
Yeah,
nothing else to think about. So I think that the whole manufacturing in Australia is, well, A, where are you going to get the staff from for anything that requires staff? The investment money, because you could end up investing in Jimmy's bearing factory in Adelaide, and then you put your $100 million into investing in that plant, and then in 5 years' time, China reopens, and you end up with, a white elephant. The other thing to think about as well is